And so now I'd like to bring to the stage Luann Roth, who's an adjunct associate professor of English and also the MU Advantage facilitator for teaching, and she's going to introduce our next speaker.
Good afternoon. I just want to try this out. Those of you who were there for the Q&A last night, if I make the following disclosure, let me see your reaction. I, too, am a liker of kale, so... Yeah. Today I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. William Ian Miller. When we first invited Dr. Miller to the Food Sense Symposium, he seemed reluctant to participate. In a conference focusing exclusively on food and food senses, evidently he doesn't consider himself to be a food studies scholar. Well, that's okay. As we shall see, his work is crucial for understanding key aspects of food, even if he doesn't address food specifically in much of his work. Dr. Miller's PhD is in English and medieval studies, and then he went on to get a law degree. He's currently coming from the University of Michigan's School of Law, where he teaches on such topics as property, legal history, and blood feuds, which I find really interesting. The eclectic list of items he has published is as intriguing as the person you're about to meet. For example, he's published 8 books, including one entitled Blood Taking and Peacemaking, Feud, Law, and Society in Saga, Iceland. Another one called Eye for an Eye. Another on Revenge and Retribution in an Icelandic Tale. Am I in the way? Okay. And a series of books on such intriguing topics as humiliation, disgust, courage, faking it, and just a few months ago, his new book came out called Losing It. One hand. What I appreciate most about Dr. Miller's work is his courage to look at the underbelly of ideas that many of us take for granted. So he's deconstructed such ideas as the books I just mentioned, but also deceit, hatred, threat, and especially appropriate to this symposium, death, danger, and dieting. Dr. Miller's book, The Anatomy of Disgust, which I think I saw on the book table outside, was awarded Book of the Year by the Association of American Publishers and is required reading, believe it or not, in food studies classes today because it is such mind-stretching stuff. So in spite of the adage, ignorance is bliss, which may be true, Dr. Miller forces us to think about things that most of us would prefer to ignore. Things like what constitutes food and food sense, where the outer boundaries of food are, and he shows us how an emotion like disgust profoundly colors our perceptions of food and eating. Eating, he writes, is one thing, meals are another. Meals are not just for eating, but for binding people together, and that's going to be the topic of his talk. The title of his talk today is called Eating with Lords. The bright side of eating is its dark side. And regarding this title, he wondered aloud, well, actually over email, whether it should be Eating Lords, Eating with Lords, or Eating with Lords with the with in parentheses. So hopefully Dr. Miller will explain why these subtleties are so significant in what it means to break bread with people. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me introduce philosopher, legal historian, and Green Bay Packers fan, Dr. William Ian Miller.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm from Green Bay. Really? Oh, okay. This will be different than what you've been listening to so far. I hope it doesn't disgust you or horrify you in other ways. Not only can food make you fat, it can make you friends. It can also make you foes. I wonder why I got invited here, other than that I wrote that book on disgust some years ago, and there's something about eating and what it leads to that invokes disgust. Food and disgust recall our very embodied existence with its assorted oozings, evacuations, reducing that once alluring dinner that the prior speaker was describing about making all ends up in one smelly mess. Isn't that, I mean, it's like a sacrilege what happens to your work. But that is not what I'm going to deal with today. No excrement, no rolls and folds of fat with smegma caught in between the layers. Rather, I'm going to discuss certain serious legal and obligational implications of eating. Because for the most part, we signal kinship and friendship by eating together. Eating alone is one of the classic images of despair. And I don't know how many of you have managed or figure out how to adjust your demeanor when you actually have to go into a restaurant and eat alone and there's not a counter. Like if there's a counter, that's fine. That's made for people to eat alone at. But if you actually have to sit at a table and you have to advertise that you couldn't find anybody who wanted to eat with you. I'm mostly going to talk about words. Words like Lord and lady and host and guest. And I'm going to talk about breaking bread and breaking bodies, and not just those of animals, but those of humans too. I will not stray too far from my main hobby horse that's been through my academic career of revenge. First, let me start simply with entertaining someone with food and drink and some of the consequences it might entail. We all know that to be invited to someone's house for dinner obliges us to make a return in kind at some later date. Not only that, we have to make a return that very evening by praising the food, eating more of it than we would wish, pretending it is better than it is. We even have to pretend the conversation has us engaged. It is all very demanding. Consider, too, we are made debtors by somebody's kindness in inviting us over, by the kindness, apparent kindness, of the host. Consider two laws among the earliest written sources we have from the Germanic peoples. This one dates from the Salic Law of Clovis, the king of the Franks, the first one to convert to Christianity, roughly about the year 500. It deals with adoption of grafting a non-kinsman into your kin group. The first thing you do, if you're the adopter, is you take a stick and you throw it in the person you're going to adopt's lap. But then the ritual shifts to the person whose got the stick thrown in his lap, the person who is about to be adopted. That person needs to officialize the adoption, and to show it's not a charade, he has to then give a dinner and have witnesses testify that he assembled 3 or more guests and fed them, and that these 3 or more guests thanked him for what they received at his table. And then you're adopted. Until you fed the guests such that you are clearly seen to be the source of the food, and thus that you have to be thanked and blessed for it, you are not in control or considered to be the owner of the property you have been given by the person who's adopting you. You had to show you had exercised the power to give food, and thus to oblige others who you have given food to reciprocate or to follow you and to honor you in return. But now consider this law from Anglo-Saxon England about the year 630. These are years that I love, and even on Jeopardy, nobody's ever asked whatever happened in 630. Nobody knows. Nobody thinks they need to know. I've made a living on it. It is, this comes from a law from 630. It too is a tale about obliging, but here it is that once you give hospitality to someone, you, the giver, may be on the hook for a lot more than you bargained for. Here's the law. If a man provides lodging for 3 nights to a traveler or some foreigner at his own home and feeds him with his own food, and that man does any harm to anyone, either the food giver, the host, shall bring him to justice, or he shall be liable for the wrongs that his guest did. What we see here is that feeding someone makes him your own. This guy ends up, in fact, adopting the stranger he brought in by feeding him for 3 days, which means he's liable for all the wrongs that guy does. Say your guest killed someone after he had stayed at your place and ate your food for 3 days. The kin of that dead man could demand compensation from you for their dead kinsman and kill you if you didn't pay up. You might it's like next time the Jehovah's Witness answers at your door asking you to have a little watchtower. So, no, don't come in here. The delightful guest, in other words, was grafted into your kin group, whether you like it or not, merely because you fed him your food, for which he would have been obliged to give you a hearty thank you. It is almost exactly the mirror image of that law that Clovis had. You know, here the person wants to be brought into the kin group and imposed as on. And here, if you give food to somebody, he's being forced upon you from that point on. You get a 3-day grace period, and that's it. No wonder there is so much to fear in a guest. They eat you out of house and home, and in that world, they could eat you to death. This anxiety about the guest is captured in the etymology of the word guest. The etymology is just the word origins. Here I need the blackboard I need. Well, I don't need it quite yet, so. The word guest, this is a tale that might be known to some of you, but it's worth the telling. It's such a good story that it gets told often and not, it gets told quite frequently. The word guest, where the ultimate origin of the word guest, also produces the word host. So you have the same word generating x and minus x, the two opposite relations. This happens quite frequently in linguistic history, by the way, where the same core concept produces exact opposite words. Now that you got me going, I'll give you 1 or 2 examples. In Old English, the word for black that became modern English black in the year, let's say, 800, the word for black was black, with a short A. The word for pale, or absence of color, or washed out, was black, with a long A. The short A one passed into modern English as black. The long one passed into modern English as the surname William Blake, bleach, bleak. But they all go back to the same core Indo-European root, which was, since we don't have the original writings of 5,000, 6,000 BC when these words, when they were at their core, what could be the core concept that generates black and bleach or bleak? And the idea, some people who study these things suggest that it must be that it might arise at the notion of burning something to a crisp, either the pure glaring radiance of a fire and then what's left. But we don't know. Anyway, but we do know that the two words are related. When we see, let me get lost here, the word guest is also a word for it. Both come from the exact same origin, and we have all the kinds, by the way, the guest host one, now that I'm off on this, the I'm losing it. The reason I wrote this book, Losing It, is I'm turning 66 in a couple of days, and I just noticed I don't remember things, and my brain's rotting. And I found out, starting to read some of the people who write about these things, that your brain starts shrinking, your brain shrinks, and your brain starts shrinking when you're in your 30s. And I thought my book, Losing It, would actually sell quite a few more copies if I marketed it as a diet book. Anyway, I'm just thinking here, I always do little frolics and detours. If you want to think of an HG, so guest host, think of the word garden. And then think of Latin hortus, garden, horticulture. And then you'll see that the same kind of thing happened there. The same word also gave rise, the same word that produced guest hosts, also gave rise to the moral opposites of hospitality and hostility. Same word. Hospitality is a dangerous thing. As we've just seen, take somebody in, feed him, he kills somebody, his kin kill you. Hotel, hospital, host is in an armed host, a host of guests, which if uninvited is what a band of raiders was, and they were hearty revelers, these raiders, just as the yahoos you count as friends can be when you invite them over and won't leave. The core sense of the word that generated all these opposites appears to be stranger, who is always a source of anxiety. Either way, the stranger as a guest you decide to invite in, or as a hostile band who invite themselves in, they threaten to exhaust your resources and your stores. You either make them welcome guests, or they make you a victim, like the sacrificial communion host, the Eucharist, of which more in a little bit. They can surround your house and capture it, or you can placate them by inviting them in and feeding them. Once inside, you all sit around the table. Eating is subject to intense ritualization in just about every culture, at least every one I'm familiar with. Eating together has an official starting point, whether it be the saying of a prayer or the host breaking some food, bread, that works as a metaphor for all food, such as bread does. In many cultures, bread does in many cultures, but meat doesn't some others, as it must, in fact, among cults that feature animal and human sacrifice, such as First and Second Temple Judaism, for instance. And notice, too, the different forms bread can take. When it takes the form of a loaf, it means one thing. When the loaf is cut or broken, it can mean another, as we shall see. And when it takes the form of hardtack or a cracker, it means hurry up, get the hell out of Egypt before Pharaoh's armies come and get you. I am purposely avoiding the issue of jockeying for seats that takes place at many a feast, and the quarrels, sometimes lethal, that arose on account of being assigned a seat next to the loser who was present, thereby making it obvious that in the eyes of the host, you were kin to the loser too, his appropriate seatmate. And the greatest of the Icelandic sagas, the enmity that starts in the extermination that ends like 30 years later in the extermination of both sides started because one woman was asked to move down at a feast for another, one seat. How many of you have kin or at weddings where there was little trouble that arose over who was to sit where? We still... King Arthur thought he avoided the issue by, of course, having a round table, because humans will always assign seats of honor. If the king sits at one part of the round table, then you better bet that the seat on the right and the left hand of the king have more value than the ones 3 or 4 over. The problem's not solved. Lord, our word Lord, that is, shows the erosion and the shifting of sounds that makes for linguistic change throughout time. Generates languages, why languages differ from one another. Back in 600, the word that became our word Lord looked like this. I got to write this big so you can see. Not going to leave myself enough room. 600, the word Lord looked like that. And modern word Lord comes from that. By the time it's first written down, it's not first written down, by the time it's first written down, it looks like this. And so we get it going to lavord, and then about the 13th century, it starts to look like this, lavard, and in the 13th century, the H finally drops off, which would have been pronounced, and we get lavard. And then by Chaucer's time, we actually are down to Lord. And we still haven't stopped because in certain dialects, people don't say Lord, they say Laud. So the R's dropped out. What will we get to? At some point, with the reduction of consonants, you start to lose redundancy in language, and you have to start adding things on. You have to add qualifiers and words to make up for the kind of loss of sounds. Don't worry, this actually. Guess what the person, okay, now I just get a few of these people out here. The person who ate at the Lord's table, this is not Lord, by the way, back when this word first started, it doesn't mean like the big Lord, it just means the head of household. So the person who ate at his table was called a laugh Atta, a laugh eater, the eater. And the lady who presided to complete all these loafs and loafers, by the way, HLAF is obviously modern English loaf, right? Loaf of bread. What does loafwerd mean? Lafwerd. Werd passes into modern English too. Loaf guard. Loaf ward, the guardian of the loaf, the person who controls the loaf of bread. These are the loaf eaters. The lady, when we first see the word lady, about the 7th century, it looks like this. Lafdiga, loaf kneader. This produces modern English. This is the same word that generates dough. Now, it's kind of funny, no accident, is it, that the word for bread or food does double duty as the word for money? Ain't got no bread. Though it is also usually meat, like flesh, that does the work for the word for money. Any examples? Pecuniary. Anybody in pecuniary difficulties here? From Latin pecus, cow, cattle. The word for fee in English, feoch, Old English, fee, word for cattle, cow. In Icelandic, fe, the word for money, is the word for sheep. The word cattle is the word chattel. Money is what you eat. No accident that it has heads and tails. The lord of the table, his loaf eaters are there. For the lachida is the Anglo-Saxon, that is, is our companions. Companion. Anybody know what panion comes from? Panis, bread. Come with. People who eat together are bread eaters together. They're loaf eaters. They're companions. And companions who eat bread together usually have to avenge one another if one is slain. And the loaf eaters at the Lord's table must avenge the Lord if the Lord is slain. They are his retainers. See, these guys kind of a rough world. You might not want to be eating at somebody's table if you think he's going to get whacked, because then you got to go take care of business. And if these companions and loaf eaters eat too much, they will, as I have metaphorically but now say literally, will eat them out of house and home, impoverish him, even starve him out, which is as good as killing him. Now let me shift gears for a second and tell you a Bible story, which I will need as a backdrop before we get back to supper. Indeed, the final supper of this paper and the last supper of the Lord. Some of you know the gruesome story told in Judges 19 of the Levite's concubine. I'll retell it. It's often expurgated even in very Bible-oriented places. This is a little too horrifying for little kids to take, even grown-ups. Here's a quick synopsis. And I doubt it will be readily apparent why this episode figures in a talk on feasts, food, and lords, but I promise I'll tie it up. A Levite from the hill country in Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem down in Judah, and he took her back up to Ephraim where he lived, and they quarreled, and she ran away and went back to her father down in Judah. Her father welcomes, he went looking for her to try and patch things up. Her father welcomes him and feasts him with food and drink for 3 days. The Levite sets out to go back home. Presumably 3 days was the limit of politeness here, that he could stay. The concubine's father begs him to stay, though one wonders if this is a mere formula that any polite goodbye should say, oh no, don't leave, please don't leave yet. And if they take you up on that, you just look at your spouse and go, what'd you say that to them for? So he sets back up with taking his concubine with him. And so the Levite and his concubine set out. Evening comes, and they find themselves in the town square of Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin, with no place to lodge, and no invitations are offered them until a sojourner who lives in Gibeah, but who's from Ephraim, the Levite's country, takes them in, washes their feet, gives them food and drink. But the men of Gibeah are a nasty bunch. And much like the ones that got God so mad that he obliterated them in Sodom, they gather around the house and demand that the host put out the Levite, the guest Levite, so that they can rape him. Or as know him in the biblical euphemism. The host resists. Do not do such an evil thing, he says. Behold, here's my daughter, a maiden, and his concubine. Take them. I will bring them out to you. Humble ye them, and do with them what seemeth good unto you. But unto this man do not do so vile a thing. But the bad men outside would not hearken to him. So the man took his concubine. The Levite takes his concubine to spare the host putting out his daughter. He puts out his concubine and brought her forth unto these men outside. So and they knew her and abused her all the night until the morning. And when the day began to spring, they let her go. Notice, by the way, that the head of the household, the guy who took them in, the host, seems to have the power as the head of the household not only to offer his own daughter up, but to offer his guest concubine up. So the absolute kind of lofty power of the bread giver to assume authority, jurisdictional authority over anybody whom he feeds and lodges. Apparently, he is indeed Lord over those to whom he gives lodging and food. But lest the host sacrifices maiden daughter, the Levite grabs his concubine and puts her out to these bad guys. The authors of the text, the biblical text, treat the women better than any of the men in the text did. The authors paint her end with pathos. And I quote now from the Authorized Version. Then came the woman in the dawning of the day and fell down at the door of the man's house where her Lord was till it was light. She did not even ask to be let in. Of course, she's dead. She can just crawl it there. But what do we make of this? And her Lord rose up in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way. And behold, the woman, his concubine, was fallen down at the door of the house, and her hands were upon the threshold. And he said, she's there, just dead. But none, and he said to her, up, and let's be going. But no one answered. Then the man took her up upon his ass, and the man rose up and got him unto his place. And when he was come unto his house, back in Ephraim, he took a knife and laid hold on his concubine and divided her together with her bones into 12 pieces and sent her into all the coasts of Israel. So he carves her up into 12 and sends her body parts out to the 12 tribes. Her body parts are sent to summon all Israel to take revenge on the tribe of Benjamin, which is well nigh exterminated. They all gather and they go down and basically genocide Benjamin. There is much of interest here, but I want to get back to food, to carving up meat for the table. We are in the midst of a ritual here that the Levite's doing with the corpse of his concubine. And one does not quite know at what point to start the ritual action. When the Levite orders her to get up, he must see she's dead. The play is already beginning then when he orders her to get up. It's already like a ritual, get up. It is not that he does not care to avenge her or that he's not moved. Indeed, he makes sure she will herself go out to the 12 parts of the land to summon her own avengers. It is her body that charges the living to do her right. Now that I have whet your appetite, let us sit down to eat. Move forward 900 years to Jerusalem, about the year 33, to the Last Supper. When Jesus celebrates the Passover and is clearly the head of the table, though the room is either rented or in which the table is set is either rented or given them by a fellow traveler so that Jesus, as a head of his peripatetic household, can guard the loaf. Except this is Passover, so the bread is not moist but unleavened. Nevertheless, it is divisible into 12 pieces, and he will break the bread and pass the cup. The difference is that Jesus accompanies the standard Passover ritual, and indeed, if the bread were leavened, standard daily ritual, by drawing out the symbolism of what he's doing and personalizing it. And I'm quoting from Luke here. And he took bread and gave thanks and brake it, and gave it unto them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me." With some time left at the end, I want to talk a little bit about remembrance. Likewise, also the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you." He is asking his loaf eaters, his followers, his retainers, his household men, to eat him, to consume him by consuming his food. But this, he says, is not his food, but he himself. The bread is the bread and the wine. The bread and the wine is his flesh and blood, and it's not metaphorical. Europe nearly exterminated itself on the issue to what degree that bread and blood were metaphorical. The Catholic Church insisting formally in 1215 that it was really the body and blood of Jesus that constituted the communion ritual. The bread is the host in its double sense of the head of the table who gives hospitality, and in the second sense host has a victim, the paschal lamb of the Passover sacrifice. Whether it is one or the other, host in one sense or host in the other, both clearly are eaten. The Reformed churches, the Protestants, took it in varying degrees rather more figuratively, for as John Wycliffe said, a proto-Protestant in the 14th century just said, no way. He said, if you asked the faithful and told them that they were really eating the body and blood of Jesus, they would, actually to translate the Middle English, he said they would vomit. Feeding gods, as when we sacrifice animals to them, butchering them on the altar, and eating the same gods seems to take place at the exact same moment. And let me clarify what I just said there. Consider that the animals used to feed the gods and to sacrifice and be sacrificed to the gods are in fact early forms of the god or the god himself. So the bull, so what's sacrificed to Zeus? But bulls. Zeus is the bull. What are sacrificed to Yahweh? Lambs. Substitute for Isaac, or Jesus as the lamb. We worship, it seems, what we eat. Those who are shepherds pray to lambs, and they sacrifice lambs. Those who raise and pray and take care of bulls sacrifice bulls and worship them. One could get fat on Christ, too. The eminent medieval historian Carolyn Bynum took great pains rightly to show that many of the devotional and spiritual exercises of the late Middle Ages were not so much barely sublimated eros, as post-Freudian scholars would want to make it, but rather alimentary, that is, nutritional images. They were more about nourishing and eating than about eroticizing Jesus or Mary. A certain style of mystical devotion that focused its intensity on the Eucharist used images of glutting, sating, and eating to describe taking in the wafer and wine. There were, in other words, gluttons for God in the multiple senses four can have in that phrase. They wanted to serve him, there is even a pun there, and eat him. Consider this 13th century saint's life of a female mystic, Mary of Oygenes. The holy bread strengthened her heart. The holy wine inebriated her. Rejoicing her mind, the holy body fattened her. Indeed, she felt all delectation and savor of sweetness in receiving it, not just within her soul, but even in her mouth. There is wit in this kind of devotion. It takes the sin of gluttony and consciously seeks to spiritualize it, enlisting it in the gut in the service of God. She gains weight, spiritual weight. The images are not spiritual, however, but very much tied up with packing it in and packing it on. Look at it from the disciples' point of view. They were asked to eat their master, and they are also eating with him. They are thus companions in its original sense, those who eat bread together, but they are also in an unequal relation of those who feed on their Lord, who is their loaf of bread, and who also breaks his body apart for them to be sustained. Or in some cultures, they might rip the god apart, as in a bacchanalia, drunk with the wine of the god Bacchus. But I would not have brought up the Levite's concubine if I did not think that Jesus was making an explicit reference to that horrific scene in Judges. Jesus is ripping himself into twelfths and hands the pieces to those men who would travel to the limits of his kingdom, to the ends of the earth. To what? To get even. To take revenge for the death to be done him by those wicked men outside the door, waiting to sacrifice him the next day. Like the Levite, he is being put up in a guest room. How like the Levite and his concubine as he splits himself into 12. Now, men, tomorrow I will be murdered. Go take revenge. I do not have the time here to show how many places this revenge-charging ritual plays itself out in many cultures, but think of Abel's blood calling out to the Lord. Think of Hamlet's ghost having to come back and present himself. It's like all over the place. There is another food-like pun lurking beneath the text. The Hebrew word for bread is lechem, but Jesus is speaking Aramaic, and it would be the cognate word lachma. But in modern Arabic, the same root that produces lechem in Hebrew or lachma in Arabic means meat. And it could in Aramaic too. The pun is not there in Luke's Greek, but in one place in Leviticus, lechem means meat. So when Jesus is showing the bread, and he says, this lechem, this lachma is my body, he's not even being metaphorical. He's saying, this meat, this is meat. It's meat, it's my flesh. Now, if you'll give me 3 more minutes, I will talk about gluttony. Hard to believe, but when the first list of the 7 deadly sins was compiled in 400 AD by one of those weird desert saints that sat on flagpoles of the early church, gluttony, not pride, headed the list. Sure thing, these saints were starving themselves in devotion to God and had food endlessly on their minds, obsessively so. It was their prime temptation. And so gluttony, not disobedience or pride, was characterized as Eve's sinful disposition. Even Chaucer's pardoner will say, "O gluttony full of cursedness, O cause of our first confusion, O original sin of our damnation." Ancient and medieval people are no less astute psychologists on this score than our psychologists are. I think rather more astute, in fact. They rightly understood that gluttony was a sin that generated other sins. It was thus rightly linked to lust. You start eating and drinking, and then you start getting the hots for the person at the table. They knew it was also a source of pride, as in the competitive food contests that the foodies engage with in each other as they have each other over as friends. Match this, right? Match this. Can't match this. They knew it all was, and they also knew it was a source of pride, because the person who could put on a good feast was a big man in the community. He was, as we saw, the Lord. Think, too, just until very recently, it was a sign of financial health and of a material well-being to be portly, to have a gut. The poor were emaciated, and the rich, then as today, must admit that it was the poor, with no intention to do so, determined what the rich will look like, not the other way around. When today, with abundant low-priced calories, the poor are fat, the rich starve themselves, become anorexic and bulimic, exercise like crazy, take pills, eat healthily and abstemiously, deny themselves all kinds of good stuff, just so not to look like the poor. And when the poor were skeletally thin, the rich fattened themselves up. They, after all, had the food to be able to do so. The psychologists back then, or those who thought, were also smarter than we are about how they understood gluttony. It was not just a function of excessive consumption as we think of it, but of excessive concern about food. So the desert ascetic was hardly escaping gluttony by fasting, nor did substituting smaller, more finely prepared delicacies in smaller proportions make you less a glutton. In fact, it made you rather more one, obsessed to the nines about the quality of your food, taking ever more time to prepare it. Today's foodie is a glutton. So is a vegan in the medieval understanding. Just too much thinking about the alimentary canal, making your palate your god, to do a variation on St. Paul, rather than the stomach your god, as we believe the poor do. The sinfulness of gluttony is not solved by smaller portions, if they are overproduced, ever so carefully prepared, ever so competitively served. But I want to bring this back full circle to the dangers of eating with lords and eating lords by reintroducing death. We today will do anything to add a few more years at the dead end of our lives. We will not eat or drink what we really want to eat or drink.
all in the name of health, but really in the name of cowardice, of quite simply being too afraid to die to ever give up on living, no matter how empty life has become. Gluttony, as the primal sin of late antiquity and the medieval world, also is a function of the extraordinary scarcity of calories in their economy. There was just not enough food to go around. The glutton was thus not just a self-indulgent pleasure seeker, merely negligent and weak-willed, nor was he a rank coward. Rather, he was more akin to a murderer. He was literally taking food out of the mouths of the starving. That is why in the parable, Dives will burn in hell as he gluts in the face of the starving Lazarus. The concern back then was rather the contrary of our more cowardly concerns. The medieval glutton was depriving others of life, though not by prolonging his own in unseemly fashion, for they knew back then, too, it was physically unhealthy to eat so much that it led to constipation and mostly kidney stones, which they complain about endlessly. Our gluttons, the fat ones, that is, are dying sooner rather than later. Could thus be argued by living shorter, they are conferring a benefit on the young, sucking less wealth out of the system than those wealthy souls so concerned to live into their 90s and 100s suck out of it. Our perpetually dieting Dives, the rich man of the parable, now is committing murder by starving others, not by starving others, but by starving himself into better health. Oh, the strange inversions of history. But later this evening, I expect to break bread with some of you and to pass the cup in utter conviviality. But know that when we eat and drink, we will be engaging in a lordly ritual, a risky one too, in which guests are enemies, hosts are hostile. The Lord offering you his food is asking you to serve him in two senses of the word serve. Serve him as a servant and serve him up. And remember, as the good old Levite indicated, demanding that you avenge him or his concubine on her enemies.
So, as in the past, if you have questions, please stand at the microphone. You can ask or Professor Miller.
Hi, that was very interesting, many things. And I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is really what anthropologists refer to as the ambivalence of the gift. And the way in which gift exchange is simultaneously an expression of aggression and hospitality, servitude and debt, which are all very interesting issues. But what I was wondering is that if you could just say a little bit more about why food matters, about how that, these sort of exchanges are carried out in many different ways, and they operate as a kind of total social fact. But when it's food that is being exchanged, does it make a difference? And if so, why? And if so, how might that get back to some of the questions that the person who introduced you was raising about food and the body and boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking, of course, a big question. But so I'll give an answer that requires tons of qualification, but I won't make the qualifications. Up until we got very rich, I mean, the primal gift was the gift of food. And so that was how you initiated exchanges, by having the feast was a crucial kind of thing. But we'll also consider that to show you how important it is, the giving of food is. It was understood also as the giving of life in a sense. So when you have like a ceremonial ritual of baptism, and in pre-Christian times, a decision would be made at the time in many societies, in fact most of them, a decision was made at the birth of any child whether you would raise that child up. And among the Icelanders, the medieval Icelanders who are my specialty, where literally this caloric scarcity, they would have to sit there and look, new kid,
We produce X amount of pounds of butter a year, we got this many kids, and they do a multiple division as to how long they can afford to raise, whether they can afford to raise that kid. And if they can't, they expose him. And most cultures will do this. And in fact, so what is this is a long way around, but I'll say this. What is the ritual act by which they take the kid in? Before the kid is exposed, he's kind of in no man's land. He can, if he dies, he's buried with the outlaws. But as soon as you do the act that admits him to the society, then killing him is murder. And the act invariably involves putting some water on their mouth or a little bit of food in their mouth. So that means you're part of the community. It's the ultimate ceremony of binding, of ingressing, of taking in. So food is so overdetermined in the amount and the symbolic loads that it bears, especially when it's scarce, and it is your primal anxiety. It is my belief, I wrote this in a Discuss book, that the only reason the modern ages can think that sex is interesting or such a serious problem, or that it is the main thought that runs through our head, is food's been taken care of. So if you go back into, in other words, our whole sexualized culture depends upon the potato. Before then, the first anxiety is where the next meal's coming from. That is the anxiety. And notice how the body actually maps onto that, so that women go amenorrheic and a scarcity of calories, and so it's just like, it's food first, then production, then reproduction. And so it's just, food's just too crucial for them. It's the end-all, be-all. There's very few circumstances where people lucked out into kind of natural, Edenic kind of situations where they never had to worry about food. The famous anthropological example is the Northwest Indians, where you just go down the river and pull out a salmon. And so they didn't have that anxiety. Now I'm going to get it.
First, let me say how much I loved that. That was really great. So I want to get into etymology and Bible here, and that judge's story is also an awesome story. I've always liked that story for its horror and its weirdness. So in the Bible, the epitome of evil, the ultimate description of evil, is that depicted by the tribe of Amalek. And the reason Amalek is evil is because they wage war in two ways. They wage war for the sake of revenge, of pursuing someone they see as their enemy, when there's nothing to be gained by it except killing the enemy. And because they do it in a cowardly way. They attack from behind instead of from the front. So they're waging war for no good reason, which is, killing the enemy, and they're doing it in a way that's cowardly. So I want to tie that in with the etymology of the word lechem, the word for bread, because the root of the word lechem in Hebrew is also the root of the word for war. So the lesson here, tied in with Amalek being the evil ones who wage war out of cowardice and to smite their enemy, is that the lesson here is that the reason the root of the word for war is bread, is, as you said, bread and money, or sheep and money are the same thing, is that the reason you fight wars is over resources. You fight wars for bread. So the only good reasons to fight wars is because you want their oil, or you want their land, or you want some resource. You want some resource that they have, but you don't do it for vengeance, and you don't do it in cowardly ways. And so the judge's story, I think, is about bread and about vengeance. So I think that creates a tension there. So I want you to talk about that in the etymology of the word.
Yeah, this is good. I'm going to have to take issue with you on some things, but Paul's dead right about there is a
In the Semitic languages, word roots are formed by 3 consonants, and the bread is lechem. So if you find those 3 lechem sounds somewhere, and the word for war, to make war, is lechem too. It turns out that it turns out they're not the same word. They are just perfect homophones. They don't go back to the same thing. So my daughter, I know this from my daughter who studies, wouldn't you know I'd produce a daughter like this, studies Akkadian, Sumerian, Ugaritic, stuff like this. So I'm going to pull rank on that with that. But it's a pun, and it is a pun. It is a clear pun. I would object to you on one thing, just the history of warfare. It's funny how different styles of fighting emerge. So desert raiding bands don't like confrontation. They like the Cossacks. You pick off the stragglers, you sit from afar and shoot bows and arrows. You don't engage in like real confrontation. You just run, you hang back, and you let your arrows do the work. The Greeks are the ones who just said, let's go march into each other. But Amalek committed the great crime of picking at the Israelites as they were going through the desert, undefended and so on and so forth. Not that the Israelites from that point on didn't find any excuse to nail Amalek in any way they could, right? So, but what do you fight for? You do fight for resources. And one of the things, what are our classic stories about? What is the Iliad? But one of the other things that's scarce is if you have a rule, if you have a warrior culture and you have to expose children at birth because you don't have enough food to raise them up, there's some argument that girl babies were exposed at a higher rate than male babies. If this was true, it meant that by the time you got to 18 or 20 in marriageable age, you were short of women in your own group. So men who don't have women around are not fun to deal with. And as the Chinese will soon discover. And so what you do is you have to go raid for women from the other tribes. That's the Iliad. That's the Iliad. You go steal the other guy's women. So you steal women, you steal food, and you take their children and raise them up, their women children. You make that's your workers if you've depleted your own. So the other thing that I didn't mention is what is the first item that is used as kind of money among people are not cows but humans. Slaves are the measure of, you transfer, that's what marriage is, right? I'll give you a woman, you give me back your kid, or I'll take the kid. So there's people exchange all the time. In my sources, in my early medieval sources, it's very funny how easy it was, for instance, for people to be able to transfer mouths to food. So if there was food surpluses at another district, and there were too many mouths to eat, if you packed up some horses and went over to buy food, it would lead to a fight. They would think you were raiding. They would defend. But if you sent, instead, people over to just move in, they said, okay. So you could move the mouths to the food. You couldn't move the food to the mouths without causing all kinds of trouble. So if you think about the circulation of calories in these cultures, it is often cheaper to send people to the food because they could get there on their own rather than having to saddle up animals and make a trip there and make a trip back. But this is all such wonderfully complicated. You see all variations and infinite variations on it.
So I noticed at the end that you pulled it sort of forward and made some connections to contemporary food issues. And I was wondering, we still have food as the center of the great majority of our social gatherings and occasions, even if we also include something else, even if we go to a movie together or something like that, there's always food at the center. And I'm wondering if you think that there's a connection between sort of the difficulty that we have perhaps reorganizing our lives in order to eat more healthily, which is something that we're always being encouraged to do, and the way that we live in a sort of atomized environment, so that in order to be as communal as we might want to be as a society, we feel compelled to constantly eat.
Well, you know, I won't quite answer that, but I'll just wind myself up and start going. Here, it's not just eat. Notice that a whole culture, at least among North Europeans for sure, and where I grew up in Green Bay, the culture consisted not so much of eating together, but of drinking together. And the importance of sharing around. It's my turn to get the pictures, you get and then everybody does the round. The designated driver rule has, of course, screwed up conviviality, totally screwed up conviviality. What is worse than when you get drunk together, it's important that everybody roughly ratchet up at the same level, because you're all going to make fools of yourself, and what you agree to do is to each have a credible threat against the other. Hey, I'm this. And if you got one person sitting there not taking part, it just kills the whole thing. It just kills everything. My 89-year-old spry mother, my niece had her significant other, I don't know what you call him nowadays, the significant other over, and it was Thanksgiving, he wasn't drinking. And she says, Blake, why aren't you having anything to drink? And he says, well, I have to drive Leah home, down to the hotel. She says, the hotel's only a mile away and it's straight down the road. and he says, no, I can't. She says, what do you mean you won't drink and drive? She says, 89, I drink and drive, and I'm still here. And I said, well, Blake, I said, the truth is that if people in Green Bay followed this rule, there'd be nobody on the highways at 3:30 in the afternoon on. Did that have anything to do? No. So it's like, why? Because you have to have something to do. You know, my belief is that we wouldn't have been able to reproduce ourselves without the assistance of alcohol. Have you ever noticed how disgusting it is to watch a person eat if you are not also eating? So when you think about eating, it's like sex. You said there, okay, I'll take this off in front of you if you'll take it off in front of me. Or I'll put this in my mouth and you watch my mouth, and if you do the same thing. You're required like to drink at the same, you like to put yourself at the same level of risk vis-a-vis each other because you're looking disgusting. Anytime anything goes in or comes out of a hole of the human body, we are in the danger zones. Well, but that's why we make it, we tame that by ritualizing it very carefully with all kinds of rituals that get rid of that danger. And the rituals are very important. They're the substance of what makes community and binds us. But that's because if you don't do it, I am overstating slightly. No, I'm not.
This is absolutely fascinating. I vaguely remember reading about blood feuds as kind of, well, let's get past the, you do it to me, we'll go kill you, all this kind of stuff. But then I went to law school and somebody told me about, law is about social control. So I'm hearing today about this elaborate system of social controls, essentially at kind of the tribal level. Not enough people, not close enough to all this kind of stuff. So, but my question is sort of like, well, I would assume in some sense, it's not exactly, we're not human beings, our DNA hasn't changed, but larger numbers of people, closer to somehow or other we're past that. But my question then are we really even remotely, in some sense, past that the tribal mechanisms of social control, or somehow or another they're just harder to see, or what? I mean, I don't know, because we have many more people, we're much more on top of each other. A lot of these kind of things kind of work with groups that are spread out, and all very much based on, we can say resources, but I like the idea, are we still essentially all doing this about food?
Not about food, but we certainly are doing it about honor and pecking order. So I never have, if any, I will again overstate something, but it's been my experience that roughly egalitarian communities, let's say like a group of law students, a class of law students, a faculty, fourth graders on the playground, that you're always sorting out who is deferring to whom and who gets attended to and stuff like that. It's still honor society writ small. We try and pretend it's not there, but notice, and our law won't allow you to claim in mitigation that because so-and-so dissed me in public, I put a bullet through his head. That you can't raise that in mitigation defense. But it's funny how the churches, the law, and economists will say that that's just worrying about sunk costs. Well, all say revenge is bad or this getting even is bad. But the Lord says, not that revenge is bad, he says it's just too good for you guys to have, it's mine. And he also, there's also this. It's just that the very state that says that we cannot use revenge, the citizen cannot use revenge as justifying why he took a certain action, as a state will gladly, as part of its foreign policy, say that we must avenge the wrong done us by, let's say, Al-Qaeda or something like that. So the very polity that it says that, oh, no, we're above that, doesn't think so. We transfer it up to that level. I just find it very hard to understand. My Icelanders, again, were very smart about this. They understood that they used the language of gifts to talk about this. They would say, and this is where Maus, the famous writer on gifts, took the saying. A gift always demands a return. But we only think of gifts as like having positive value. So somebody invites you to dinner, and even though that poses a burden on you, you have to pay it back. But the Icelanders understood that gifts ranged from negative value to positive value. So if you kill my brother or rape my sister, that's a gift too. And I would not be a man. It's of negative value, but what does a gift mean? And they'll say, somebody just gave you a gift, Miller. They just killed your brother. And you wouldn't be a man if you don't repay it. Somebody just helped you cross the river when it was flooded. They saved your life and pulled you out of the water. You would not be a man if you did not repay it. So the primal moral obligation is to repay debts. Some of them have positive value, are good things that were done you. Some of them raised our debts of negative value, but they understood it all as a kind of golden rule, are playing on the same axis. In our culture, we've done a lot to disengage ourselves from it because in our culture, again, moral responsibility has been weakened, like by bankruptcy laws, where debts can be, written off, or you can drive the country down to a sinkhole and get bailed out for it. And I don't know. I'm not saying I could do well back. Hey, look, I'm a weenie academic. I don't want to go back to the world of Icelandic sagas because I get the crap kicked out of me so fast it wouldn't be funny. But even a thug, a tough mother, has to go to sleep at night. Which means that the tough mother had to play fair or he'd have a very short life. So I always ask my students, what do you do if you're the leader of a Viking ship?
You're on a ship with 40 axe murderers. How do you go to sleep at night? Well, you have some rules. You play fair. Everybody understands that you're basically all in an enterprise together. You, as a group, take care of your real badass members and kick them out. And you have to have, otherwise, you can't go to sleep.